Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In contrast to the last speech, which was an ill-informed diatribe of criticism about the Scottish Government, I rise to address the bill which is before us this afternoon. And I'm going to use what precious time we have to speak in favour of Amendment 204. This amendment would introduce to the bill a subsection to Clause 11 that would remove the Human Rights Act from the list of protected provisions in Schedule 4 to the Scotland Act. And this would have the effect of removing the Human Rights Act from the list of enactments that cannot be modified by the Scottish Parliament. If the Scottish Parliament was able to modify the Human Rights Act, that would allow the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to fully establish a human rights regime in Scotland, regardless of whether the Human Rights Act was repealed by this Parliament in London. This Government, which has no mandate in Scotland, have repeatedly made it clear that it's their intention to repeal the Human Rights Act and to replace it with the Bill of Rights. They have made it clear that they scorn European and international norms on human rights and the jurisdiction of the European Court on Human Rights. They've made it clear that they want to replace the Human Rights Act with a watered-down version of the rights and protections which presently everybody in the United Kingdom enjoys, and we saw that very much trailed in the Sunday Times yesterday. Madam Deputy Speaker, we do not in Scotland want to have the terms of the debate on human rights in Scotland dictated by this Parliament, because in Scotland we have a very different agenda. There is no mandate in Scotland for repeal of the Human Rights Act. Preserving the Human Rights Act was an issue during the campaigns in both the independence referendum and the general election. The Scottish National Party has consistently opposed repeal of the Human Rights Act, and as my friend, the Right Honourable Member for Murray has already said, we won the general election in Scotland. Indeed, when one includes Labour and Liberal Democrats' sole representatives in Scotland, 58 out of 59 of Scottish MPs opposed repeal of the Human Rights Act. Last year, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I'll just make some progress if you don't mind. Last year, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Scottish Parliament voted by 100 votes to 10 votes to endorse the Human Rights Act. And civic society in Scotland, from the STUC to the Church of Scotland, are opposed to the repeal of the Human Rights Act. Nevertheless, this UK Government has repeatedly confirmed that they intend to go ahead with repeal of the Human Rights Act, and it will apply equally in Scotland as in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. In Scotland, we are very concerned by repeated statements from the ministers of this Government which suggest that they believe that they could repeal the Human Rights Act without consulting the Scottish Parliament. Their argument seems to be that they wouldn't need a legislative consent motion. But that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is incorrect. Human rights are not a reserved matter under the devolution settlement. Schedule 4 to the Scotland Act protects the Human Rights Act against modification by the Scottish Parliament, but human rights per se are not a reserved matter. They're not listed as such amongst the reserved matters set out in Schedule 5 to the 1998 Act. It was part of the late Donald Dure's scheme that all matters would be devolved unless they were specifically reserved. Human rights are not specifically reserved. Moreover, Madam Deputy Speaker, human rights and the European Convention on Human Rights is written into the Scotland Act, so that the Scottish Parliament and Scottish ministers cannot carry out any legislation or act that's incompatible with European Convention on Human Rights. No, I think I'll make progress, Madam Deputy Speaker.
He spoke at length.
We've heard quite a lot from the honourable gentleman, and these are important points of great concern to the Scottish electorate, and I want to make them very clear. In Scotland, we have a national action plan. In Scotland, we have a national action plan for human rights. We've got a United Nations accredited Scottish Human Rights Commission, and our commitment to human rights extends not just to the ECHR, but beyond that to social and economic rights.
Didn't bring them up.
Through our work on social justice, well, the honourable gentleman is clearly desperate to get his oar in, so I'll give way.
Of course he.
I thank the honourable lady for her views. She raises some very important issues, but she's prejudging what the Secretary of State for Justice might bring before this House. It might very well be a beefed-up human rights regime that the Scottish people will want.
It's really very hard, Madam Deputy Speaker, to take that point seriously.
Exactly.
As, since we've been in this House, through judicious questioning of the government front bench, we have established that one of the government front bench's main concerns with the Human Rights Act is a fear that they should have to take account of the decisions of the Strasbourg Court. That's all the Act says. So, in fearing that they should have to take account of European and international norms, I can only assume that what they want to introduce to replace the Human Rights Act is something that has been considerably watered down from the ECHR and the Human Rights Act. That's merely a logical deduction. I wonder if I might give way to the honourable gentleman on the Labour front bench who wished to raise a point.
I thank you very much indeed. I was going to simply make the point that I agree with her what she's saying about the Human Rights Act, but would she accept that what she says about Scotland also applies to Wales and Northern Ireland especially?
I do, yes. And as our First Minister has made clear, and I've also made clear on the floor of this House several times, it's our intention to do everything we can to preserve the Human Rights Act for the whole of the United Kingdom. And in fact, if the government benches would recognise that human rights are not a reserved matter, and would recognise that therefore there has to be a legislative consent motion, we may well in Scotland be able to help friends across this House, because we would refuse legislative consent to the repeal of the Human Rights Act, and that way would be one way of us keeping it for the whole of the United Kingdom. But the point of my speech today is to move an amendment which gives the Scottish Parliament the option, in the event that all our attempts fail to preserve the Human Rights Act for the whole of the UK, the point of this amendment is to give the Scottish Parliament the chance to fully implement a replacement for the Human Rights Act in Scotland. Now, my concern is this. The government has said repeatedly that they don't recognise that human rights are a devolved matter. They say that they're reserved. So we have to have a fallback position in Scotland. I urge the government to remember their respect agenda, although they don't seem to be listening at present, but I urge them to remember their respect agenda and to go back to their Scotland Act with some decent lawyers and look at it carefully, and they'll find out that human rights are not a reserved matter and that they're devolved. And they needn't just take my word for it. There's a very sizable body of academic opinion that supports that. However, the purpose of this Amendment 204 is to recognise that when it comes to the proprieties of the devolution settlement, the respect agenda of which the Prime Minister spoke so often in the past is consigned to the dustbin of history, along with the assurance that Scotland was an equal partner in the Union and various other promises that were made by the Better Together parties during the independence referendum, including the vow. I've made it clear that it's our primary intention in the SNP to fight to retain the Human Rights Act for the whole of the UK. However, the disrespect with which our previous amendments to this bill have been met, and the recent exclusion of all Scottish MPs from the Joint Committee on Human Rights gives me and my colleagues on this bench absolutely no confidence that the wishes of the Scottish electorate will be respected by this Parliament.
Well, would my honourable and learned colleague give way? I've just noted from a sedentary position a Conservative backbencher responding to her point about the SNP being excluded from the Human Rights Committee of this House by saying, good. Might she take the opportunity to take an intervention from the honourable gentleman so he can explain why the party that represents almost every single constituency in Scotland should be excluded from that important committee of this House?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for drawing that to my attention.
Sit down.
And I will be delighted to take the intervention and to hear why this honourable member, who I believe is a lawyer of sorts, thinks it is acceptable for all Scottish MPs to be excluded from the Joint Committee on Human Rights. Will he tell us and the people of Scotland why he thinks that's acceptable?
What is important, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we have sensible lawyers on that committee. The Honourable Lady keeps stating that it's not a reserved matter. It is a very obvious reserved matter to the United Kingdom Parliament. And that's my point. That's my point.
Was that it?
Well, I'm sure that the viewers in Scotland who are watching just now, and the people who will read this debate in Hansard tomorrow, will be very interested to hear what the honourable member has just said. And we're very interested to hear that he thinks it's acceptable that all the elected representatives of the Scottish electorate are excluded from a joint committee of this House, whose purpose it is to scrutinise bills of this House for human rights compliance across the UK.
I'm grateful to our honourable friend. He'd probably be equally delighted that there's 6 unelected donors and cronies from the House of Lords on that committee and no place for any Scottish Member of Parliament on it.
Yeah, we must be.
I'm sure he will.
Must be.
But I think what his interventions indicate, what his interventions and his earlier speech indicate and underline, is the reality of the concern that we have on this side of the House, that the wishes of the Scottish electorate in relation to the preservation of the Human Rights Act will not be respected. I reiterate that we wish to make common cause with the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, members from Northern Ireland and members from the other side of the House to preserve the Human Rights Act for the whole of the United Kingdom. I want to, we want to. I said we. If you listen carefully, I know my accent's a bit difficult to follow, but I said we. So our primary position is that we intend to preserve the Act for the whole of this United Kingdom. However, the purpose of this amendment is to give us the option to be sure that we can implement the settled will of the Scottish people to keep the Human Rights Act for Scotland in the event that we're not successful in keeping it for the whole of the United Kingdom.